mean I'll see it.
I never thought I'd be one of those people who ends up as a cautionary tale on a late-night podcast, but looking back, the signs were there from the very first month. Elias was perfect, almost too polished, like a piece of marble that had been sanded down until there wasn't a single human flaw left. He told me he was the sole heir to a shipping fortune out of Antwerp, and he certainly lived like it. We had this sprawling, mid-century modern house on the edge of the woods, filled with expensive art and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. He spoke 3 languages fluently, moving between them with a grace that made me feel like I was living in a movie. Everything was effortless. He never went to an office, claiming his wealth was all tied up in trusts and offshore accounts that he managed from his study. He'd spend hours in there, doors closed, taking what he called investor calls. I'd hear the muffled cadence of his voice through the wood, sometimes sharp and commanding, other times soft and pleading. I just figured that's how high-level finance worked. We spent our weekends traveling to cities I'd only ever seen in magazines, eating at places where they didn't even put prices on the menus. He bought me jewelry, clothes, and eventually he bought the ring. It was a vintage piece, a massive emerald surrounded by diamonds that looked like it had a history of its own. The cracks only started to show when we went to get the marriage license. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon errand, a boring bit of bureaucracy before the lavish wedding we were planning. But when the clerk ran his information, her face went from professional to confused, and then to something that looked a lot like suspicion. She told us there was a snag, some kind of clerical error with his social security number. Elias didn't blink. He just laughed it off, leaning over the counter with that charming, lopsided grin of his, and told her his family's lawyers probably messed up the paperwork when he moved from Europe. He promised to handle it. But that look on the clerk's face stayed with me. It was a cold, nagging needle in the back of my mind. A few nights later, while Elias was at the gym, I did something I'd never done before. I went into his study. The air in there was different. It was stagnant, smelling of old paper and something else, something faint and sickly sweet, like fruit that had begun to ferment in the dark. I started going through his desk, expecting to find bank statements or maybe a secret credit card. Instead, I found a leather-bound ledger hidden in a false bottom of a filing cabinet. It wasn't a ledger of investments. It was a ledger of people. There were names, hundreds of them, mostly elderly. Next to each name were dates, social security numbers, and lists of assets, pension, 401k, family home. But the most disturbing part was a folder tucked into the back. It contained a death certificate for a man named Marcus Thorne, who had died in a horrific car accident 10 years ago. There was a photo of Marcus attached to a newspaper clipping about the wreck. Marcus didn't look like Elias, but as I looked closer at the documents, I realized Elias had been using Marcus's entire life, his credit, his history, his very identity, to build the ghost of the man I thought I was marrying. I felt a sudden, oppressive sensation in my chest, a stifling realization that the man downstairs wasn't a prince, he was a parasite. He wasn't managing a fortune, he was draining the life savings of people who had worked 50 years for a quiet retirement. He was a professional identity thief who had recycled a dead man to hide his tracks. My stomach turned, a visceral wave of nausea hitting me as I realized the lavish trips were paid for by the stolen dreams of grandmothers and widowers. I should have left then. I should have just walked out the door and never looked back. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to see how deep the rot went. I remembered him mentioning a wedding dress he'd commissioned from a private designer in Europe. He told me it was a family tradition, something that would be delivered in a locked trunk and kept in the attic until the big day. He'd been very insistent that I wasn't to look at it, saying it was bad luck for the bride to see the garment before the ceremony. I climbed the pull-down stairs to the attic. The air up there was stifling, the heat pressing down on me like a physical weight. I found the trunk in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. The lock was old, but the wood around the hinges was soft. I used a screwdriver from the toolkit downstairs to pry it open. When the lid creaked back, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of old fabric or mothballs. It was a wet, metallic reek, the kind of odor you find in a butcher's shop where the drains have been clogged for days. It was the scent of raw, aging meat mixed with something chemically sharp, like formaldehyde. Inside, wrapped in yellowed silk, wasn't a dress made of lace or satin. I reached out and touched it. The material was cold and slightly tacky to the touch. It felt like damp, cured leather, but it was too thin, too translucent. As I pulled the garment up, my heart began to hammer against my ribs with a frantic, rhythmic thud. It was a gown, yes, but it was made of patches of skin. Different shades, different textures, all meticulously stitched together with fine, silver wire. Some sections still had faint traces of hair, others were marked with the faded outlines of tattoos that had been stretched and distorted. It was a morbid, visceral tapestry of human remains. The wedding dress wasn't a family heirloom. It was a collection. A trophy. I realized then that Elias didn't just recycle identities, he recycled the people themselves. He didn't just take their money, he took pieces of them to keep as souvenirs of the lives he had consumed. I told you not to look in there. The voice came from the darkness behind me. It wasn't the smooth, European lilt I was used to. The accent was gone, replaced by a flat, hollow, Midwestern tone that sounded like it was being squeezed through a throat made of gravel. I spun around, my flashlight beam shaking, to find Elias standing at the top of the attic stairs. His face was different. The charm had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, blank mask of a man. His eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting the light like a predator's. "You should have stayed curious about the money, Sarah," he whispered, stepping into the cramped space. "Money can be replaced. But the dress is personal. It takes a long time to find the right pieces. To find someone whose skin is as clear and soft as yours." He moved toward me, and I saw he was holding a long, thin blade, a surgical scalpel that glinted in the dim light. I didn't think. I didn't scream. I just reacted. I swung the heavy screwdriver at his head, feeling the sickening crunch as it connected with his temple. He didn't fall, but he stumbled, a dark, viscous fluid beginning to leak from the wound. It wasn't bright red, it was dark, almost black, and it trickled down his cheek like oil. I scrambled past him, my boots slipping on the attic floor. I threw myself down the stairs, falling the last few feet and hitting the hardwood with a jarring impact that sent a bolt of white-hot pain through my shoulder. I didn't stop. I ran for the front door, not even grabbing my purse or my keys. I burst out into the night air, the cold wind stinging my lungs as I sprinted toward the woods. I didn't go to the police right away. I was terrified that he had people everywhere, that he had stolen the identities of the very officers I would talk to. I took a bus 3 states away, changed my name, and cut my hair. I live in a small, basement apartment now, working a job that pays in cash. I never stay in one place for more than a few months. Sometimes, when I'm walking home at night, I'll hear a voice behind me, a smooth, charming accent that sounds just like him. Or I'll catch a whiff of that fermented, sickly sweet smell in a crowded grocery store. I try to tell myself I'm safe, that he's just a ghost I left behind in that house. But then I remember the trunk. I remember how the dress was almost finished, except for the sleeves. He had been waiting for the right material to complete them. And every time I look at my own arms in the mirror, I can almost feel the phantom sensation of silver wire pulling tight against my skin, stitching me into a history that was never supposed to be mine. The worst part isn't the fear that he'll find me. It's the realization that I don't even know his real name. I was going to marry a vacuum, a hollow space where a person should have been, and he's still out there, walking around in someone else's shoes, waiting for the next piece of the dress to present itself. I just hope the next girl is more curious about the money than I was.
Next story.
People always told me I'd hit the jackpot with Mark. He was the kind of guy who didn't just listen, he studied you. If I mentioned in passing that I liked a certain type of wildflower, there'd be a fresh bouquet of them on the kitchen island the next evening. He was quiet, soft-spoken, and had this way of moving through our home that was almost completely silent. I used to think it was graceful. Now, I realize it was practiced. We had been married for 3 years, and in all that time, I'd never seen him lose his temper. Not once. He was like a calm lake, beautiful on the surface, but you could never quite see what was happening at the bottom. Our house was one of those modern, minimalist builds, lots of glass, open spaces, and gray tones. It felt clean, but there was always this stifling atmosphere I couldn't quite put my finger on. I felt a constant, burdensome pressure on my chest whenever I spent too much time in the master bedroom. I chalked it up to anxiety or the isolation of the suburbs. Mark worked from home as a data analyst, or at least, that's what he told me. He spent 10 hours a day in his locked home office, and I never questioned it. He provided for us. He was perfect. The shift happened when I was looking for a box of old winter sweaters. Mark was out for his daily 5-mile run, something he did with robotic precision every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock. I went into our walk-in wardrobe, a massive space lined with cedar and oak. As I was reaching for a bin on the top shelf, I slipped and braced myself against the back wall of the unit. The wood didn't feel solid. It gave way just a fraction of an inch, making a dull click that echoed in the quiet room. I pushed again, harder this time. A section of the oak paneling, about 2 feet wide, recessed into the wall and slid sideways on a track. My heart started thumping against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. I stepped through the opening into a space that shouldn't have existed. It was a narrow, windowless corridor that smelled like old electricity and something else, something sharp and metallic, like the air in a butcher's shop or the tang of a wet penny. At the end of the crawl space was a small, cramped room lit only by the bluish glow of a dozen monitors. I walked toward them, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. On the screens, I saw our life. Every single room of the house was mapped out in high definition. There was a camera in the shower, tucked behind the tile grout. There was one inside the vent of the guest bathroom. There was even a camera lens embedded in the eye of a stuffed bear I'd had since I was a child, which sat on my nightstand. But it wasn't just the live feeds that made the air feel thin and unbreathable. On the desk below the monitors were stacks of external hard drives, hundreds of them all meticulously labeled. I picked one up. It said, Year 2, Month 4, Resistance and Emotional Breakdown. I sat in his swivel chair, the leather still warm from his body, and clicked through a folder on the main computer. It was a video of me sleeping from 3 months ago. The footage was sped up, but then it slowed down to real time. I watched as Mark entered the frame. He wasn't sleeping beside me. He was standing over me, holding a long, thin needle. He stood there for 45 minutes, just watching me breathe, his face completely blank. Then he gently pulled back my eyelid and shone a tiny light into my pupil, recording my reaction. I felt a surge of cold nausea. I wasn't his partner. I was a specimen. Next to the keyboard was a leather-bound journal. I opened it, my eyes blurring as I tried to process the neat, architectural handwriting. The pages were filled with charts and graphs, rating my wife's performance on a scale of 1 to 10. He tracked my menstrual cycle, my caloric intake, the number of times I'd smiled, and the exact duration of my laughs. I flipped to the most recent entry, dated yesterday. Subject to showing signs of cognitive dissonance, it read, "The curiosity levels are peaking. She spent 4 minutes today looking at the wardrobe panel. Deviation from the ideal spouse script has reached 18%. The previous iterations, Sarah and Elena, both failed at 20%. It's a shame. This one had such a high tolerance for the isolation. But the data is clear. Once they begin to look behind the curtain, the variables become too chaotic. She's getting suspicious. Time to reset the cycle." word reset sent a jagged shard of ice through my spine. I turned the page and saw a series of Polaroids tucked into the back cover. They weren't of me. They were of 2 other women. They looked remarkably like me, same blonde hair, same slate build. But in the photos, they weren't smiling. They were lying on a stainless steel table, their skin pulled back in neat, surgical flaps, their internal organs exposed and labeled with tiny plastic tags. The smell I'd noticed earlier, the one that wasn't copper but something more primal and raw, hit me with full force. It was the scent of old, dried fluids and chemical preservatives. I realized then that the meat in the freezer downstairs, the stuff Mark said was specialized venison for his diet, probably wasn't deer at all. I heard the distant sound of the front door opening. The digital clock on the desk read 4:35. He was back early. The silence of the house suddenly felt predatory. I knew the layout of the cameras now, which meant I knew he could see me. He probably had an alert on his phone the second I stepped through that partition. I looked at the monitor showing the front hallway. Mark was standing there, stretching his hamstrings, looking directly into the hidden camera lens in the hallway mirror. He smiled. It wasn't a smile of greeting, it was the satisfied look of a scientist seeing a predictable result. He didn't run for the stairs. He didn't scream. He just walked slowly toward the kitchen and opened the drawer where we kept the specialized cutlery, the heavy, professional-grade cleavers. I didn't have time to go back through the wardrobe. He'd be waiting in the bedroom. I looked around the tiny, suffocating room. There was no other exit. I grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the desk and pressed myself against the wall beside the sliding panel, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I heard his footsteps on the carpet. Soft, rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. Honey, his voice drifted through the wardrobe, sounding genuinely concerned, which made it 10 times worse. I noticed the panel was open. Are you in there? You know I don't like it when you mess with my work archives. It creates inconsistencies. I stayed silent, the paperweight slick with the sweat from my palm. I could feel the dense, stifling heat of the small room pressing in on me. I really hoped you'd be the one, he sighed. The sound was so close now. He was standing just on the other side of the wood. The others, they were too impulsive. But you were so compliant. We had 3 years of perfect data. Do you have any idea how hard that is to achieve? It's a tragedy to have to start over from scratch. I saw his hand reach through the opening. It was a pale, steady hand. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't afraid. He was just doing a job. I didn't wait. I lunged forward and slammed the glass weight down onto his knuckles with everything I had. I heard the sickening, wet crunch of bone breaking, a sound like dry branches snapping under a boot. He didn't scream. He just let out a sharp, hissed intake of air. I shoved past him, my shoulder catching him in the chest. He stumbled back into the bedroom, his hand dangling at an unnatural angle, bits of white bone peeking through the torn, red mess of his skin. The sight was visceral, the jagged edges of his metacarpals glistening under the bedroom lights. He didn't look at his hand. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, glowing with a terrifying, ecstatic light. Yes, he whispered. That's a 25% deviation. Remarkable. I didn't stop to hear the rest. I bolted down the stairs, my socks slipping on the hardwood. I grabbed my car keys from the bowl by the door. I didn't grab a coat. I didn't grab my phone. I just threw myself into the driver's seat and floored it, the tires screaming against the driveway. I've been driving for 6 hours. I'm at a rest stop now, typing this on a burner phone I bought at a gas station. I can't go to the police yet. Mark is a data analyst for a firm that handles municipal surveillance. He has friends in every department. He's probably watching me right now through the highway cameras or the GPS in this car. The worst part isn't that he tried to kill me. It's the realization of what I saw in those files. The folders weren't just labeled with names. They were labeled with generations. I saw a folder at the very bottom of the drive. It was dated 20 years ago. It had my mother's name on it. I think the experiment didn't start with my marriage. It started the day I was born. And if I'm the third reset, I need to find out who the first two were before he finds me. Because when I looked in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, he wasn't chasing me. He was just standing in the doorway, holding a stopwatch and checking the time. I'm still parked at this rest stop, staring at the blurry photos I managed to snap of the monitor before I bolted. The images are burned into the back of my eyelids. I can't stop thinking about Sarah and Elena. Those names weren't just on the hard drives, they were the titles of entire volumes of what Mark called the biological optimization logs. When I looked closer at the folders, I realized that I wasn't the first person to live in that house, and I certainly wasn't the first person to die in it. Mark didn't just want a wife, he wanted a map. He wanted to know exactly how much a human spirit could take before it snapped, and once it did, he moved on to the physical breakdown. Sarah was the first. Her folder was the largest because her performance lasted the longest, nearly 5 years. According to Mark's notes, she was the baseline. I found a video file labeled Sarah, Final Deviation. It wasn't a quick ending. The footage showed her in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I made us coffee every morning. She was crying, but she wasn't making any sound. She was just staring at a plate of food. Mark's voice came from off camera, that same calm, reasonable tone he always used with me. He told her she was becoming inefficient. He said her emotional responses were no longer providing useful data. The video cut to the basement, to a part of the house I thought was just a crawl space for the furnace. It had been converted into a sterile, white room that looked more like an operating theater than a home. Sarah was strapped to a table, her eyes wide and darting. She wasn't screaming because her jaw had been wired shut with surgical precision. Mark was there, wearing a plastic apron, methodically explaining to her that her physical components were still valuable, even if her personality had failed the experiment. He didn't use a knife at first. He used a series of small, vibrating tools to peel back the skin of her forearm, just to observe the muscular response to stimuli. The screen was filled with the sight of raw, red tissue pulsing under the harsh fluorescent lights. There was no blood at first, just a weirdly clean, clinical look at the clockwork of a human being. But then the fluid started to leak, a dark, viscous liquid that soaked into the white sheets. It didn't look like what you see in movies. It was thick and had a yellowish tint to the edges. Mark didn't seem bothered. He just wiped it away with a sponge and kept taking notes. Sarah's eyes, they never closed. He used some kind of drops to keep them from drying out so he could record her visual terror metrics until the very end. Elena was different. Her folder was labeled Elena, the resistance variable. She didn't last as long as Sarah, maybe 18 months, because she fought back. There were photos of the house in total disarray, broken glass, smashed mirrors, and bloodstains on the cream-colored carpets. But Elena didn't get away. Mark had recorded the way he broke her down. He didn't use violence initially, he used sleep deprivation and sensory redirection. He'd rig the vents in her room to pump in a faint, cloying scent, not like a chemical, but like rotting lilies mixed with the scent of warm, wet iron and salt. It was the smell of a body beginning to turn. He wanted to see how long it would take for her to associate that smell with her own inevitable end. By the time he moved her to the basement, Elena didn't look human anymore. She was skeletal, her hair falling out in clumps from the stifling, dense stress he'd put her under. The last photo in Elena's file is what's making me sick to my stomach. It was a close-up of a glass jar in the freezer. I remember seeing those jars. Mark told me they were culture samples for his data firm. They weren't. Inside the jar, Preserved in a clear, yellowish brine was Elena's tongue. There was a tiny plastic tag tied to it with a piece of silk thread. The tag said, "Variable, verbal defiance. Status, terminated." Mark hadn't just killed these women. He had disassembled them. He'd taken them apart like a child taking apart a watch to see how the gears turned, and then he'd kept the pieces that interested him. He cataloged the weight of their organs, the density of their bones, and the exact volume of fluid they lost during the reset. He was looking for a pattern, a way to create the ideal spouse by weeding out the parts of us that made us human, the parts that felt fear, or anger, or suspicion. And then there was the folder from my mother. I clicked on it with a sense of leaden, suffocating dread. My mother had disappeared when I was 6. My dad, or the man I thought was my dad, told me she'd just walked out on us. But the file told a different story. Mark hadn't been her husband, but he'd been there. There were photos of her from when she was young, photos taken from a distance, through windows, from the back of a car. Mark had been observing her for decades. He'd watched her raise me, and he'd been taking notes on my development from the very beginning. He wrote that I had promising genetic markers for resilience. He'd waited for me to grow up, for me to look just like her, and then he'd stepped into my life to start his own branch of the experiment. I wasn't a reset for him. I was the culmination of a 20-year study. He didn't love me. He didn't even see me as a person. I was just the most advanced model in a long line of prototypes. The most gut-wrenching realization hit me when I remembered the specialized venison he'd been feeding me for the last 3 years. It was always finely minced, seasoned with far too much garlic and rosemary to mask any other flavor. He'd encouraged me to eat it, telling me it was pure protein to help with my vitality. I think back to the jars in the basement, the labels, and the way he'd smiled when I asked for seconds. The thought makes a cold, oily sweat break out over my entire body. He wasn't just observing the reset cycle. He was making me a part of it in the most literal, visceral way possible. He was feeding the failures of the past to the success of the present. I looked at the burner phone screen again. There was one more folder I hadn't opened. It wasn't labeled with a name. It was just labeled current status. I tapped it. It was a live GPS feed. There was a small, pulsing red dot on a map. I recognized the layout of the roads immediately. It was a map of this rest stop. The dot was hovering exactly where I'm parked. I looked up at the rearview mirror. The parking lot behind me is empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the sodium lamps. There's nothing but a dark SUV idling near the entrance, its headlights turned off. But I can see a faint, bluish glow coming from the driver's side window, the glow of a laptop screen. He didn't need to chase me. He already knew where the experiment was headed. He was just waiting for me to finish reading the data so he could begin the final deviation report from my file. I can hear the sound of a car door clicking shut in the distance. It's a soft, rhythmic sound. Click. Thud. I need to start the car. I need to move. But my limbs feel like they're made of stone, and the air in here has suddenly turned cold and thin, smelling faintly of lilies and wet, rusted iron.
Next story.
David was the kind of guy who made you feel safe just by sitting in the same room as him. He was calm, focused, and had those steady hands you'd expect from someone who spent their life under the bright lights of an operating theater. We'd been living together for about 18 months, and our routine was as solid as a rock. He'd leave for the hospital around 8 in the evening, and I'd wake up to the sound of the shower running at 6 in the morning. He always smelled like a mixture of industrial bleach and that sharp, stinging iodine they use in clinics. It was a sterile scent, one that I found comforting because it meant he was home and he was safe. Being a surgical resident meant he was constantly exhausted. He'd crawl into bed with skin that felt cold to the touch, his eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. I used to joke that he was a vampire, but he'd just offer a tired smile and say that saving lives didn't leave much room for a 10. I was so proud of him. I used to tell my friends that I was dating a hero, someone who stayed up while the rest of the world slept, stitching people back together. The first crack in that reality appeared on a random afternoon. I was folding laundry when the landline rang. It was the hospital's billing department. They were looking for a Dr. Miller regarding some internal administrative error with his payroll taxes. I told them David wasn't home, but I could take a message. The woman on the other end paused, the sound of keyboard clicking filling the silence. Then she asked me to clarify the name. Dr. David Miller, I repeated. Surgical department. There was another long silence, a silence that felt oppressive and strange. She told me that they didn't have a David Miller on staff. Not in surgery. Not in the ER. Not even in the cafeteria. I assumed it was just a clerical mistake, but the way she said it, so flat and certain, stayed with me. I didn't confront him that night. I watched him get ready for work. I watched him put on his blue scrubs and pack his leather satchel. He kissed me on the forehead, and for the first time, I noticed how the scent of bleach didn't quite cover something else, something underneath it that smelled like raw, spoiled meat left out in the sun. It was faint, but it was there. I waited 10 minutes after he pulled out of the driveway, then I got into my car. I didn't turn on the headlights until I was a block away. I followed him through the city, past the turnoff for the hospital, and deeper into the industrial district on the edge of town. The streets out there are cracked and empty, lined with rusted chain-link fences and warehouses that look like they haven't seen a worker in decades. David pulled up to a derelict loading dock behind a building with boarded-up windows. 2 men were waiting for him. They weren't wearing scrubs. They were wearing expensive, sharp suits that looked completely out of place in that graveyard of industry. One of them handed David a thick envelope, and my boyfriend nodded, slipping it into his bag. He didn't look like a tired surgeon anymore. He looked efficient. He looked like a man going to his office. He unlocked a side door and disappeared inside, the 2 men following him. I parked my car behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets and crept toward the building. My heart was thumping against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. I found a gap in the plywood covering one of the low windows. The glass was gone, replaced by a layer of grime that I had to wipe away with my sleeve. The room inside wasn't a hospital, but it was set up like one, in the most horrific way possible. There were portable halogen lights standing on the concrete floor, casting harsh, flickering shadows against the salt-stained walls. In the center of the room was a long steel table. A man was lying there. He wasn't draped in sterile sheets. He was stripped to his waist, his skin a sickly, pale yellow under the artificial light. He was alive, but barely. His chest was moving in shallow, ragged hitches. David was standing over him. He had put on a long, clear plastic apron over his scrubs, the kind of thing a butcher wears. He was laying out tools on a folding card table. They weren't all medical. I saw bone saws, industrial pliers, and thick rolls of duct tape. He moved with a terrifying, practiced grace. There was no hesitation in his hands. I watched, paralyzed, as he began to work. This wasn't surgery. It was a systematic dismantling. He wasn't trying to save the man on the table. He was extracting something. He used a scalpel to open a jagged line from the man's sternum down to his navel. There was no anesthesia. The man on the table tried to scream, but David had already stuffed a thick wad of gauze into his mouth and secured it with tape. The sound that came out was a wet, muffled gurgle, a sound that will never leave my mind. The air in that warehouse must have been freezing, but I could see the steam rising from the man's open cavity. The smell reached me through the window then. It wasn't just the metallic, salt-like tang of fresh blood. It was the stench of the gut, the foul, acidic odor of everything that's supposed to stay inside a human body being exposed to the air. It was thick and humid, filling my lungs until I felt like I was choking on it. David reached inside. He wasn't looking for a tumor or a ruptured organ. He was reaching past the lungs, his hands disappearing up to the wrists in the dark, glistening mess of the man's torso. He pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped package that had been hidden deep within the body, a drug mule who hadn't made the trip, or maybe something even more valuable. He tossed the bloody parcel to one of the men in suits, who caught it without even flinching. Then, David began the cleanup. That's the part that haunts me the most. He didn't stitch the man back up with the care of a doctor. He used a heavy-duty stapler. The rhythmic thud click of the metal biting into the skin was the only sound in the room. When he was done, the man on the table wasn't moving anymore. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, glazed over like a fish on ice. David didn't look sad. He didn't look disgusted. He just looked bored. He began to wipe down his tools with the same industrial bleach I smelled on him every morning. He took off the plastic apron, which was now splattered with a dark, brownish-red map of the man's life, and folded it neatly. He walked over to a large plastic drum in the corner and began pouring a clear liquid over the body on the table. The skin began to hiss and bubble almost instantly. I backed away from the window, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I stumbled back to my car, my mind a fractured mess of images. The way the light hit the blood, the way David's hands didn't shake once, the way the man's eyes looked in those final seconds. I beat him home by 20 minutes. I crawled into bed, fully clothed, and pulled the covers up to my chin. I heard his car pull into the driveway. I heard the front door lock. I heard him walk into the bathroom and turn on the shower. A few minutes later, the door opened, and the bedroom filled with that familiar scent. Bleach. Iodine. Antiseptic. He climbed into bed next to me, his skin cold as a corpse. He reached out and ran a hand over my shoulder, his touch light and gentle. "You're awake," he whispered. His voice was so kind. It was the voice of a man who cared. "Just a bad dream," I managed to say, my throat feeling like it was full of broken glass. "Go back to sleep," he said, kissing the back of my neck. "I'm here. You're safe." I stayed perfectly still, staring at the wall in the darkness. I could feel the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest against my back. I knew then that the scrubs he wore home weren't stained with the effort of saving lives. They were soaked in the residue of a different kind of labor. I realized that the man I loved wasn't a surgeon. He was a janitor for monsters, a man who knew exactly how to take a human being apart and make them disappear. And as I lay there, I realized something even worse. He hadn't washed his hands long enough. Underneath the overpowering sting of the bleach, I could still smell it. The raw, humid scent of the warehouse. The smell of the man who was no longer a man. I'm still in the house with him. I don't know where to go. If I leave, he'll know why. He's a doctor, after all. He knows exactly how to find every vital point in the dark, and he knows exactly how to stop the screaming.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.